$214 billion. That is the volume of trade Russia and Iran cleared in a single month, March 2026, denominated in Chinese Yuan, settled outside the United States dollar, untouched by any correspondent bank on American soil. Not last year, not over 12 months, 1 month. The number sat in a Bank of Russia statistical release for 9 days before anybody in the Western financial press wrote about it. And even then the coverage was buried under a headline about ruble volatility. 6,000 tons of gold currently rest in the central bank reserves of BRICS member states. 50% of the world's gold mining output now flows through their refineries. And on October 31st, 2025, a settlement instrument called the BRICS Unit went live in production, backed 40% by gold, 60% by a basket of BRICS currencies, cleared through a CBDC bridge that connects the central banks of China, Hong Kong, the United Arab Emirates, and Thailand. This is Professor Steven, and I want to spend the next 20 minutes walking you through something that has been built piece by piece for 7 years, in plain sight, in published documents, in central bank press releases, and that almost nobody outside a few corners of the international monetary economics profession has fully assembled. Subscribe if you want stories like this before the screaming headlines arrive, because the screaming headlines are coming, and when they do, they will be wrong in both directions. They will tell you the dollar is dying tomorrow. The dollar is not dying tomorrow. They will tell you nothing has changed. Everything has changed. The actual story sits, as it usually does, in the boring middle. And the boring middle is where the money lives. Let's start with the Russia-Iran settlement number, because the settlement number is the proof of concept. $214 billion in monthly bilateral trade between two sanctioned economies is, on its own, an astonishing figure. For context, total annual U.S.-China trade in 2024 was about $580 billion. Russia and Iran are clearing more than a third of that volume in a single month between two countries that 10 years ago could not have processed a transaction of that scale outside the dollar system without somebody losing access to it. They are processing it now. They are processing it through CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system operated by the People's Bank of China, which by March of this year was clearing 1.22 trillion yuan on its peak day, roughly $178 billion US dollars equivalent. The Russia-Iran trade flow is one piece of that. The Saudi yuan-settled oil flow is another. The UAE-Hong Kong gold settlement is a third. Here is what I want you to understand about CIPS. Because the misunderstanding I see most often online is treating it as a clone of SWIFT. It is not. SWIFT is a messaging network. It tells banks where money is supposed to go, and the money itself moves through a web of correspondent banking relationships that ultimately settle through accounts held at the Federal Reserve. CIPS does both jobs. It carries the message, and it settles the value. That distinction is the entire game. If you can carry the message but you still have to clear the value through New York, the United States can switch you off. If you carry the message and you clear the value in Shanghai, the United States cannot switch you off. CIPS is the second of those two architectures, and it has been operational since 2015. What changed in 2025 was that the Bank of China conducted what it called the first major rules overhaul of the CIPS system in 8 years, effective February 2026, building toward what their own internal documents describe as a multi-currency settlement layer. Read that phrase twice. Multi-currency settlement layer. That is the language a central bank uses when it is preparing to clear trades that do not involve the issuing country's own currency. It is the language of building a public utility, not a national payment system. Then there is mBridge. mBridge is the part of this story that the Western financial press has been most allergic to. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks headquartered in Basel, the most establishment institution in global finance, ran a project called Project mBridge from 2021 through 2024 in partnership with the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates. It was a wholesale central bank digital currency bridge. The idea was to allow commercial banks in the 4 jurisdictions to settle cross-border payments directly in central bank-issued digital currencies, bypassing both SWIFT and the correspondent banking system entirely. The pilot moved real value. Real trade transactions. 22 commercial banks participated. Settlement took under 10 seconds. Then, in October 2024, the BIS announced it was exiting the project, and the project did not stop. It continued under the direct stewardship of the four central banks that built it, with Saudi Arabia joining as an observer, and as of the most recent disclosures, with active production volume routing oil trade payments between Saudi banks and Chinese counterparties in CNH, offshore yuan. I want to read you the language from the BIS working paper that documented the pilot, because the language matters. The paper says the system can achieve instant atomic settlement between four central bank ledgers without any reliance on either SWIFT messaging or correspondent banking. Atomic settlement, in financial engineering terms, means the trade either fully completes or fully reverts. There is no half state in which one side is paid and the other has not delivered. That is the holy grail of cross-border settlement. The BIS just built it, in production, in collaboration with the Chinese central bank, and then publicly walked away from it, leaving the asset operational in the hands of the four founding members. You do not have to be a conspiracy theorist to find that sequence of events extraordinary. Now layer on the BRICS Unit, which went live October 31st, 2025. This is the instrument that I think is most poorly understood. The unit is not a currency. It is not a replacement for the dollar. It is a settlement basket. 40% of its weight is allocated to physical gold held in vaults across BRICS member states, and 60% is allocated to a weighted basket of BRICS currencies, with the weights tied to each country's share of intra-BRICS trade. Think of it as a unit of account, in the way that the IMF special drawing right is a unit of account, but backed by something physical that you cannot freeze with a keystroke. The unit can be used to settle trade between BRICS member states without either party having to hold dollars, hold euros, or hold the other party's currency. It clears through a consortium of central banks. The early use case is intra-BRICS commodity trade, primarily oil, gas, copper, and grain. The gold piece of this is where I want you to spend some time, because the gold story is the one that connects all the other pieces. The World Gold Council publishes a quarterly central bank gold purchases report. The 2025 full-year figure was net official purchases of approximately 812 tons. That is the second highest annual figure on record, behind 2024's 870. The three-year cumulative net purchase by central banks is over 2,400 tons, more than was bought in the entire decade from 2000 to 2010. The buyers are not who you might expect. China is in there, openly, with the People's Bank of China publishing month-over-month editions. Russia is in there, less openly, with the bulk of editions estimated by World Gold Council analysts, because Russia stopped publishing detailed disclosures in 2022. Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore, the Czech National Bank, the National Bank of Kazakhstan. Roughly 50 central banks are net accumulators. Net sellers, by contrast, can be counted on one hand. Why are central banks buying gold at the highest pace in modern monetary history? Because gold is the only reserve asset that cannot be frozen by the issuing country. When the United States and the European Union froze approximately $300 billion of Russian Federation foreign exchange reserves in February 2022, every other central bank on Earth watched. The lesson they took is not that they should refuse to do business with the United States. The lesson is that the share of their reserves they hold in dollars represents counterparty exposure, and counterparty exposure needs to be diversified. Gold has no counterparty. A gold bar sitting in a vault in your own capital cannot be frozen by anybody. The freeze of Russian reserves was, in effect, the loudest sales pitch for gold accumulation that has ever been delivered to the global central banking community. BRICS member states collectively now hold approximately 6,000 tons of gold. That is not the entire world's central bank gold. That is closer to 35,000 tons. But 6,000 tons is enough to back a settlement system. 6,000 tons at current spot prices is roughly $420 billion in collateral. That collateral is what makes the BRICS unit work. It is also what makes the Hong Kong Precious Metals Central Clearing Company, the new Hong Kong Gold Clearinghouse scheduled to come fully online this summer, viable as a settlement infrastructure. The Shanghai Gold Exchange's offshore vault in Hong Kong has expanded from roughly 200 tons of vault capacity to a planned 2,000 tons within 3 years. Tenfold growth. That is not a marketing project. That is industrial preparation for physical settlement at scale. Let me catch myself here because I do not want to oversell it. And there is a version of this story that is being told online right now that will get a lot of people hurt financially. The dollar is not collapsing tomorrow, and anyone telling you it is selling you something. I will say that as plainly as I can. The dollar's share of identified global foreign exchange reserves was 72% in 2000. It is approximately 58% as of the most recent IMF CIVR data. That is a decline of 14 percentage points over 26 years. It is also still by an enormous margin the largest single component of global reserves. The euro is around 20%. Everything else fights over the remaining 22%. The yuan's share of identified reserves is roughly 2.5%. 2.5%. Not collapsing the dollar territory. The yuan's share of global SWIFT payments, and SWIFT is a flawed measure because it captures messaging volume rather than settlement volume, is roughly 3%. The dollar is around 48%. The euro is around 28%. The euro is around 24%. The numbers do not support a narrative of imminent dollar collapse. Anybody who tells you they do is either confused or fishing for your credit card. The story that the numbers do support is something more subtle and more durable, and it is the story I think you need to hold in your head. The dollar is not being replaced. The dollar is becoming optional. Those are two different things. A dominant reserve currency that controls 100% of global trade settlement is an empire. A dominant reserve currency that controls 58% of trade settlement, where the other 42% has functional alternatives, is a hegemon with rivals. The historical comparison is the British pound between 1920 and 1950. The pound did not collapse in 1925 the way dramatic narratives sometimes imply. It held majority share of global reserves until the late 1930s, and substantial share until the late 1950s. What happened during that 30-year window is that the alternative, the dollar, became infrastructure that could actually carry the weight. By the time the pound formally ceded the role at Bretton Woods, the work of replacement had already been done in dozens of small administrative decisions stretching back 2 decades. We are, in my reading, somewhere around 1934 in that analogy, not 1925 when the threat was still theoretical, not 1948 when the transition was nearly complete. Somewhere in the middle, where the rails are being laid, the alternative is becoming usable, and the central banks of the world are quietly diversifying their exposure 10 basis points at a time. Every quarterly report from the World Gold Council, every CIPS volume disclosure, every BRICS Unit settlement is one small administrative decision in a process that historically takes decades. The decades are running. Now let me bring this home to you specifically, because I do not want this video to be an academic exercise. The reason this matters to your wallet is the reason that nobody's talking about. The United States government runs a fiscal deficit that has averaged just under $2 trillion a year for the past 5 fiscal years. It finances that deficit by issuing treasury bonds. Those bonds are bought in part by foreign central banks holding dollar reserves. The dollar's role as the dominant reserve currency means that those purchases happen at very low yields. Central banks buy U.S. treasuries because they need to hold dollars, not because they think the yield is particularly attractive. That structural demand for treasury debt is what economists call the exorbitant privilege. It is the privilege of borrowing at lower rates than your fiscal trajectory would justify because the rest of the world has nowhere else to park their savings. If the dollar's share of global reserves drops from 58% to, say, 45% over the next 15 years, the marginal demand for treasury debt at any given yield drops with it. The treasury still has to fund the deficit. So the yield rises. So the cost of borrowing across the U.S. economy rises because treasury yields are the benchmark off which every other rate in the U.S. economy is set. The mortgage rate you pay is benchmarked off the 10-year treasury. The corporate bond rate that determines your employer's cost of capital is benchmarked off treasuries. The auto loan you take out, the credit card APR you carry, the student loan you are still paying off, all of them are derivatives, in the financial engineering sense, of the treasury yield curve. If the treasury yield curve shifts up by 100 basis points, because the structural buyer of last resort has been quietly diversifying for 15 years, the mortgage rate you pay on a refinance in 2032 is 100 basis points higher than the model your financial planner is currently running. On a $400,000 mortgage, 100 basis points is roughly $270 more per month, $3,200 a year. For 30 years, that is the dollar amount that sits invisibly behind a sentence like BRICS de-dollarization. Your 401k is also exposed, in a way that is harder to model but no less real. Roughly 60% of the average U.S. defined contribution retirement account is held in U.S. equities. Those equities are priced, in part, off a discount rate that reflects U.S. interest rates. If the discount rate rises because dollar dominance erodes, the present value of every future corporate earnings stream falls. The S&P 500's price-to-earnings multiple, which is currently sitting around 23, partly reflects the cheap capital assumption that dollar dominance underwrites. A world where the dollar is one option among several, and where Treasury yields run 200 basis points higher than they otherwise would, is a world where the average P/E multiple compresses. Compressed multiples mean lower equity prices for any given level of corporate earnings. The retirement portfolio you have spent 30 years building is, at the margin, exposed to the question of how many central banks decide to settle their oil for gas trades in yuan over the next decade. Here is the case for it mattering. The strategic objective the BRICS architecture is pursuing is not the destruction of the dollar. It is the optionality of the dollar. The goal is to make sure that the next time the United States reaches for the sanctions lever, the next Russia, the next Iran, the next country that runs afoul of Washington, there is somewhere else to go. If there is somewhere else to go, the sanctions lever is weaker. Every weakening of the sanctions lever is a transfer of geopolitical power away from Washington and toward Beijing, Moscow, and the central banks of the global south. That transfer does not require the dollar to collapse. It requires the dollar to be optional. The infrastructure to make it optional is being built right now, in production, on a published timeline. Here is the case, for it mattering less than the headline writers will tell you. The BRICS Unit, as of June 2026, has cleared only a fraction of the trade volume that the optimistic projections predicted. CPS still relies on SWIFT messaging for more than 80% of its actual transactions, which means the messaging dependency on Western infrastructure has not been engineered away yet, only declared a target. The yuan is not freely convertible. China still maintains capital controls that limit how much yuan can move in and out of the country in any given quarter, and those controls are the single biggest obstacle to the yuan ever becoming a true reserve currency. You cannot run capital controls and also be the world's open reserve currency. The contradictions are real. The transition is slower and more contested than the dramatic narrative implies. Let me bring it back to ground, to what you can actually watch over the next 18 months, because I would rather give you instruments than predictions. Watch the IMF's quarterly seal for release. It is the official scorecard. If the dollar's share drops below 55% in any single quarter, that is a signal worth paying attention to. Watch CIPS daily volumes. They are published by the PBOC. If they sustain north of 1.5 trillion yuan daily through 2026, the system has scaled past pilot status. Watch the Hong Kong Gold Clearinghouse after July. Does it actually fill? Do sovereigns route trades through it, or does it sit empty as a prestige project? Watch the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield on auction days when foreign central bank participation falls. Treasury Direct publishes the indirect bid data after every auction. If indirect bids start consistently coming in below the running average, foreign central banks are stepping back from the dollar marginal bid. And watch what the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, says about dollar policy in public versus what the Working Group on Financial Markets does in private. The public language will tell you what they want you to believe. The private actions will tell you what they actually fear. I will leave you with the question I cannot fully answer, and I would rather hand it to you honestly than fake a tidy ending. If a country decides the dollar is not collapsing but is becoming optional, builds the rails to settle trillions of dollars in trade without your permission, stands up a gold-backed unit to clear the difference, and waits patiently for the next 15 years to do the small administrative work of replacing the infrastructure of an empire, at what exact point did that stop being someone else's monetary story and start being the line item on your mortgage statement? This is Professor Steven. I'll see you in the next one.